Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 43 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I had such a great discussion with Jessica Maitland Mayo and Micki Burns of Judi's House for this episode. And I think this is really a great episode to bring you here in the first full week of Children's Grief Awareness Month. So Judi's House is in Denver, Colorado. So if you're in that area, definitely check them out. They have fantastic programming for bereaved children and for the entire family of those children, so including the widowed parents there. And check that out. I've heard great things about the programs they have. In addition to that, Judi's House, through their part they call the JAG Institute, is doing an incredible amount of research, really important research. And so I'd encourage everyone to listen to our discussion here, even if you're not in the Denver area, because these guys are doing terrific research in partnership with the New York Life Foundation, which you've heard mentioned on the podcast before. They are the biggest funder of childhood bereavement work. They've put millions of dollars into this. Maybe more, I don't know. Anyway, they've partnered with Judi's House on a number of things, but including especially this thing called the CBEM, C-B-E-M, Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model, which, may sound kind of academic, but basically what they've done is they've done research into just how prevalent the problem of childhood bereavement is, statistics. They've got great information by state, so I'll put those links in the show notes. And also we got into a really great discussion about some of the challenges of accessing care for bereaved families and bereaved children. You've got peer support models, you've got the medical model and some of the limitations there. In other words, when I say medical model, I'm talking about trying to access counseling through health benefits. Really just fascinating discussion. And I kind of joked around a little bit with them about this study that they wrote. I'm going to link that in the show notes too. I'd encourage you guys to take a look at it. A little bit long, a little bit dense, but so interesting and so important. So if you feel like looking at that, I'd love to know what you think. Drop me a line, jenny@jennylisk.com, and let me know what you think about that. Anyway, in addition to all of this, so Jessica is the new CEO of Judi's House, and she is also a widowed parent herself and was previously a client of Judi's House a number of years ago. So we talk about her journey, her experiences and, as a family and helping her children, as well as her experience as a client of Judi's House. And Micki is the chief clinical officer, so the perfect person to talk to about all the research they're doing and the fantastic work there. Anyway, without further ado, I give you my discussion with Jessica Maitland Mayo and Micki Burns of Judi's House. My guests today are Jessica Maitland Mayo and Micki Burns from Judi's House in Denver, Colorado. Jessica is the new CEO of Judi's House, and Micki is the Chief Clinical Officer. Micki and Jessica, I'm so glad to be talking with you today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jenny. We're glad to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to talk to you this morning.
Yeah. I'm really glad to be talking to both of you for a few reasons. First of all, I think Judi's House is fantastic, and I really want to dive into what you guys do and offer for listeners who are maybe in your area in Denver. Secondly, because Jessica, and we'll get more into this, but you're a widowed parent yourself, and I'd love to dive into your journey and your reflections. And then, so maybe I'm really just weird, but you guys wrote this journal article that is so interesting. I find it fascinating. I'm just going to read the title. It sounds really dull. Comprehensive Grief Care for Children and Families, Policy and Practice Implications. And Micki, I think you're one of the lead authors on this, along with your team there. But I got to tell you, it was not dull. I thought it was so interesting. And we'll get more into this later. But I just want to say that I think it really helped a bunch of things click for me, as far as, support, what kind of support is out there in the existing models and what was working and what doesn't work, and really where the gaps are. Because I think as a widowed parent encountering this, it's hard to understand. And I'm just going on and on here. I could probably talk all day, and I have so many highlights on this. But anyway, super interesting. So we'll table that for now. But thank you for putting that out there.
It was definitely a culmination of work from a lot of people here at Judy's house, but also people across the country who are doing really good work. So I look forward to talking about it in a little more depth in a bit.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, perfect. So before we dive into that, let's start, Jessica, with you. Because as we said, you are a widowed parent. So can you just back way up for us before you became a widowed parent, before your life changed, back when everything was normal? Can you tell me a little bit about your life before your husband died?
Sure. Yeah, that does seem like a long time ago at this point.
and how long ago was it?
Well, my husband died 6.5 years ago at this point.
Okay.
So we had been married for 20 years, and we met actually in high school, so had been together a very long time. And I worked in the nonprofit world for a long time. I had a job with our local blood center, doing nonprofit management and fundraising and marketing and communications. And he ended up going to night school to become an attorney. And eventually we had 2 kids. And we lived a pretty typical full life that you do at that time, kind of in your 20s and 30s working on your career. And my husband actually ended up with a bunch of different health complications that we had a hard time figuring out what they were. So we spent about 6 to 8 years really working hard to figure out what was actually wrong with him. So that became a big part of our life leading up to the time that he died.
Yeah. And this was a time then when the children must have been quite small.
Yes. Yeah. So when he actually died, my kids were 7 and 11. So okay. I think for my 7-year-old, the majority of his life, we were going through that difficult time leading up to his death.
Yeah. Okay. So what were those early months, or the early period, I guess, however you want to define that? What was the early time like for you as a brand new widowed parent with these? You said 7 and 11?
7 and 11. So my husband actually died by suicide. And that period of time for me was incredibly hard. And I think for me, because the time leading up to his death was hard, the time of his death was hard, the time after his death was hard. I think because he died by suicide, we faced many of those circumstances that many people face who are experiencing death by suicide, where the world is curious and you have thoughts of, what do I share? What do I not share? And frankly, when I think about that time, I think mostly about this extreme desire to try and protect my children to the best ability that I could. I mean, when I think back on that time, that was my number one motivation. I had this mantra in my head that frankly is still in there, is what do I need to do to make sure my kids are okay? Mm-hmm. Whatever that is. I think also for me, particularly when I think about that time, which wasn't that long ago, I was working in a job that had its own level of high pressure. I was part of a senior management team, and the demands were pretty high and the expectations were kind of 24/7-ish in that role. And that split time of trying to show up for what my job needed of me, or my community needed of me, or other people needed from me, and then also to personally come home and wrap my arms around my kids and make sure I'm present for them. So that struggle of trying to do both at the most difficult time of my life, when I look back, I think it's actually not possible. Those expectations that I put on myself, and I think from talking to other people in similar circumstances, you can't expect that you can fulfill all those requirements to the degree that you feel that you should. So, I think I remember those feelings quite a bit, of how do I make all of these areas give my best performance when you're at a place where you just can't.
So then what approach did you take? Did you leave that job or cut back, or did you try to stick it out, or how did that play out?
Frankly, I didn't leave that job. And even though it was a challenging job, it was for the most part, as much as a job can be, was a supportive environment. I'd been there for so long. And frankly, I think when we talk with a lot of people who have lost a spouse, there was a level of, to speak candidly, of fear. You go down from being 2 breadwinners to 1 breadwinner. It felt like a time that I needed to be as front and center as possible so that I can continue to support my family.
And benefits too. I mean, that's a huge piece of it.
Yep. I remember going to work every day thinking I've got this, I can do this, kind of talking myself up for the game, and kind of having this idea in the back of my mind, if I can't make it all work out, what's my backup strategy, but I think, but I did stay. And actually I had lots of great friends there and lots of good support. But no matter how much support you have, you're still in a work environment. There are demands and outputs, and you've got to meet those demands. And I have always felt very responsible about my work ethic. So I was trying hard to be all things to all people at a really challenging time. And there's just no way around that, is how I felt.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something that a lot of listeners can relate to. I mean, I hear similar themes and struggles from the widowed parents that I talk to.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's one of the hard things is when you're going through that. If you don't have folks around you who have had similar experiences, or folks that you can talk to who understand that, there's lots of empathy, but really understanding that feeling, it can be challenging. You can feel alone in those feelings.
I want to go back to something you said about your number one priority is protecting your kids. And you mentioned that your husband died by suicide. So what did you find, I guess, and also, I guess, if you could talk a little bit about, the how you juggled the questions, like what did you decide how much to disclose or not, or kind of navigating that, and then as it relates to the kids, I guess sometimes you hear the idea that people want to try to protect them maybe by not disclosing the whole truth. Is that, what did you find about how much telling the kids is protecting them versus not protecting them, if that makes sense?
No, it makes complete sense, Jenny. And it's such a good question. And I think probably every parent has a different experience as they head into that. To speak very frankly, I was concerned about suicide for quite a while before it actually happened. And I think because of that, I had the opportunity to think through maybe what my approach may be or would be, although you can never really prepare yourself. For me personally, I decided that I wanted to be as honest as possible with my kids and frankly with the world. I didn't, as hard as it was, I didn't want to approach it in a way that was dishonest, because I think you have to double back and kind of answer questions if you didn't address them head on in the first place. Even though my kids were 7 and 11, I worked hard to talk with them in ways that they could understand, and then provide support for them, from me, of course, but any other resources I could find to help them kind of start to integrate what they were learning. I know the day that he died, one of the things as a worker that I had to do or did do was I felt this obligation to tell my team at work, because I'd been in a management role for so long. I'd seen things like this happen before. And I wanted to tell my team that my husband died, he died in this way, and that I was okay with that information being shared. So folks didn't have to worry or work through or fill in the blanks. And I made a commitment that I would speak openly about what happened, that's how he died, and that it's a struggle, and that it is something that happens in our world more often than people oftentimes talk about. So I wanted to make sure I was being upfront. To be another voice that puts it out there instead of putting it aside.
Right. Yeah. I think that's so important. So thank you. And just to follow up on the piece with the kids, one of the things I've learned from interviewing people is this idea that if you're not honest with the kids about something difficult like a suicide or a drug overdose or maybe a homicide, it can actually make a really bad situation worse, because it ends up destroying their trust in that surviving parent, which is the very person they need to lean on and trust for, as a foundation for everything.
That's so true, Jenny. And I can't tell you, I had several people say that I should just say that his heart stopped, or come up with another story and double back later. And none of that felt right. And even though none of that felt right, I will say that that day was the hardest day in my entire life. And finding the words to tell your 7-year-old and your 11-year-old that their father is dead, and it just, while that is the right thing to do, it's the most difficult thing to do as well.
Yeah, definitely.
But as you say, I think it sets a platform for honesty moving forward and trust.
Right.
That we can tackle the hard things together.
Exactly. Okay. At some point, I think you found your way to Judi's house as a I don't know, a participant, a client. I'm not sure what you call it, but can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I was a client. And it's interesting. One of the things we talk about in our community is that Judi's house doesn't do any marketing, and we don't. But when you need Judi's house, when somebody needs Judi's house, it's pretty typical that at least 3 people refer you there out of the blue. Like the community just kind of rallies around folks when you don't know what to say to someone who's experiencing something so tragic and awful. It's wonderful in our community that there's actually this action that people can take. There's an actual resource that can be offered. And I actually felt that as several different folks recommended Judi's house to me. I already knew about Judi's house beforehand. So I was grateful for that. And the victims advocate that was with our family recommended the organization to us, as well as several friends. And I was one of those classic clients that I have learned about now in my new role, that wanted to get in immediately, like tomorrow, like the next day, like you need to start helping me right now.
Yeah.
I learned after the fact that's not always the best approach, and it takes time to settle before you come and can access our services. But so I brought my 2 kids and myself to the organization, and we spent a full year accessing our services. And it made a huge difference for us. It was truly a safe place to come and bring all the complications and all the reactions and all the feelings, that there wasn't time or space in our world for an outlet for that. So,
Awesome. So I want to hear more about Judi's house programs in a minute here. But first, just I guess to kind of round out this part of the discussion, maybe with some reflections. I guess, what do you wish you had known ahead of time about widowed parenting as you look back? Maybe what has surprised you the most, or what would have been really helpful to learn sooner? What do you know now that you would tell someone?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, I think for one thing, there is no roadmap. There's no one way to go through grief. It's as unique as the individual and the set of circumstances. So looking for a norm that you're going to fit into is a mistake, because there is no norm. And you probably heard from the way I described myself in the beginning. I guess if I could look back, I would like to tell myself that it's okay to bow out of some things. I think I had this feeling that, we're going to show up for all the things that you're supposed to show up for. We're going to keep marching forward. And, I learned as I went along that it's okay to maybe not to go to school on that day, or don't find a stand-in for the father-daughter dance. Just don't do it. Take a day that folks feel like they can't do it, and just stay home and watch movies. I mean, just the opportunity to bow out more. And because I think when you're bowing out, you get to reconnect with each other. And I think that was probably one of the only balms that really made a difference for us. So I wish I had figured that out earlier.
Yeah. As you just mentioned the father-daughter dance, I'm imagining a chorus of groans from listeners right now, because
right?
I think it's a sore subject among a lot of us, right?
I can tell you a story. My daughter was in Girl Scouts, and there was a father-daughter camping trip. And it was literally like, I don't know if it was 6 months after. And if I had it to do over again, I tried to go and take her and be the parent, and I should have just said no. I just, how you approach those things is tricky.
It is. It's super tricky. And you don't know what's the quote unquote right answer. And, maybe the answer is there's not a right answer, but anyway, you're looking for the right answer. And for me, I found not only do I not know what the answer is or what I should do in that, for example, in that camp out, but I don't even know who can tell me what I should do.
Right. Well, I don't think there is anyone, right? So
well,
you kind of trust your sources, and then you chat with who you need to chat with. And then for me, I guess I think I just try and feel what my kids need and what I need. And sometimes it's different. And I guess that's the other thing too, is I think I was surprised that my kids would have triggers that I didn't see coming And then some things that I thought would trigger them didn't. So you just got to stay on your toes emotionally to respond to what's happening. And your thing isn't like other people's things. So how do you remain flexible?
Well, that is a really good, because I found that too. Can you give us a couple examples maybe of something that you didn't expect to be triggering, and then all of a sudden, you know, you had a problem on your hands that you weren't. I mean, I think everybody expects, okay, tomorrow's the death anniversary, so that's going to be a hard day, right?
Yeah.
But there's other stuff that pops up all the time, right?
Yeah, I think for my son, we came to the end of a school year, and I didn't track that usually his dad would pick him up on that day. It wasn't even a tradition. It's just the way it worked because of the timing of the schedule. And he fell apart on that one because it was supposed to be, and I didn't see that coming at all. I don't know. It's just being responsive to the best of your ability, but you can't always respond well either because you're going through it too.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Judi's house then. Well, I guess first of all, how did Judi's house get started and when, and kind of give a little bit of backstory there?
You bet. I think the story of Judi's house in some way, to me, Micki, you may disagree, but it feels to me almost like a fairy tale when you tell the story. In 2002, we were formed, and our founders are Brian Greasy and Brooke Greasy. And Brian Greasy had his own death loss experience when he was 12. His mother passed away from breast cancer. And the way he tells his story is he really felt at that time that he was very alone in that experience. Really didn't have very many peers or the type of support that really could understand what he was going through. And I think in looking back, he wished that there had been more of a supportive environment from the community around him or some type of resource that could make him feel less alone in that grief. When he came to Denver to play football for the Broncos, he ended up meeting his future wife, Brooke Greasy, who was getting her PhD in psychology. And the way the story goes, which sounds like a legend, but it's true, I've confirmed. On their first date, they talked about what they would do for kids if they both could. And they kind of on the back of a napkin came up with this idea of an organization that could support grieving children and families.
Wow.
And this amazing marriage between someone who had personal experience and a platform as an NFL player and was willing to use that platform for the good of our community, which is amazing by itself. Becoming involved with somebody who was in school and wanted to make a difference for children in need. And the two of them decided to come together and make this amazing organization.
Yeah.
So nearly 18 years later, they created this place that is a haven for families that are experiencing grief and loss and trauma, and a place that can hold them during that time.
Yeah. How cool. How cool.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. So who then... You're in Denver. Who do you guys serve?
So we serve grieving youth between the ages of 3 to 25.
3 to 25. Okay.
3 to 25 is how we define that. So technically, our mission and our vision is around grieving children, but our concept is we wrap our arms around the whole family. So our vision is that no child should be alone in grief. And what we do is if there is a child in the family unit that is experiencing a significant death loss, we welcome the whole family into our services. And so that's who we serve within our community.
So welcoming the whole family means then that you have some programming for adults, for the parent, the surviving parent as well?
Yes, that's exactly right. So we have our initial program is called Pathfinders, and it's a 10-week program. And we do that quarterly. We kind of re-up with new families that come through. It's a 10-week program, and we look at the entire family. So I could use myself as an example.
Yes.
I came in as a widowed mother with my 2 children. And the amazing thing about the way we operate is we separate the family so that folks are in group therapy sessions with other members that look like them. So for example, my 7-year-old son was in a group with other kids about his same age who are experiencing a death loss through suicide. So while he is working through his group therapy, he's really having the opportunity to sit with kids who are having similar experiences to him, which is rare.
Wait, you guys have a big enough program that all the kids in his group not only were around his age, but also had a suicide loss?
My experience, yes. I mean, I think, and Micki, you can correct me, it depends on how many folks are coming through our doors, but I will say this is one of the reasons why we have one standalone organization. And sadly, the need for our services is significant enough that we can group by death loss so that the folks who are going through, in my group of adults that I sat with, it was all, I think that's correct when I look back, all lost through suicide. And if you look at our numbers, we see annually about 1,400 folks come through our doors. Okay. So opportunity to group folks according to their experience.
Yeah, that's quite a large number. So a little bit more on this Pathfinders program then. So you mentioned that it's 10 weeks. What can participants expect over the course of the 10 weeks?
So we have an actual curriculum. So we kind of use the Pathfinder models. We help them through their journey of their own unique grief experience. Each group has a licensed clinician that is facilitating that experience. And then oftentimes there's also a companion volunteer, a volunteer who's also in the room as well. And we really help. Each week we have a theme and some topics and some shared language. And the hope is that while we have, the teens in one room, the preteens in another room, the adults in another room, kind of working through similar language, similar coping skills, similar tools, that as they leave that night, drive home in the car, or during the next week, we've kind of created some shared language to help them through the process and be able to have a commonality to speak through what they've learned.
So on any given night, then your different groups are covering, I don't know what the right word is, like the content that kind of coordinates with each other so that they can have that share. It's not like one group is talking about something, another group, something totally else.
Right. And I don't know, Micki, if you want to jump in and share a little bit about the journey of Pathfinders and some of the specifics, what that looks like.
Oh, I think you did an excellent job of covering it. I think our hope is that we are, through this process, helping families to find connection and shared language, as Jessica said, to be able to take the program home with them. We definitely want for communities to be able to find their support, not just at Judi's house, but create it in their own households and in their neighborhoods and in their schools, and making meaning out of something that can be tragic and devastating. So we say that our overarching goals for the Pathfinders program are to prevent some of the negative complications of bereavement that we know can happen, while promoting the positive resilience reactions that we also know can be part of the grief experience.
And I think too, all of it ties, if you look to our mission, we really talk about supporting children and families who are grieving a death. And we talk about them finding connection and finding healing. So helping give them the tools and the resources that they can tap into their own healing processes, and also help them find connection. So if they can, as my kids and I experienced, you feel so alone in the world with a very unique experience. If you sit with others that look like you and sound like you, to the extent that that's possible, if you help them find connection, the connection helps in your healing process. And we see that happen time and time again.
Very good. Okay. And Micki, since I think you're involved in a lot of the research aspects of this, do you guys have any analysis or outcomes or measurements or something about the impacts of this program?
Yeah, we're very fortunate that from the get-go, with Brooke being a doctoral level clinical psychologist, she said research will be a part of everything that we do. So our model, we call it comprehensive grief care, and the foundation of that model is evaluation and research. So all the work that we do, we're asking our families, while they don't pay a fee for our services, they are helping us to build a body of knowledge that we can share with the field at large. And so what we know specifically about our Pathfinders program, playing on the work of others in the field, other wonderful researchers that are out there, we know that the number one predictor of how well a child will adjust to a loss, such as the loss of a parent or sibling, is how well that caregiver is doing. And so providing that part of our program is so important to us, because if mom's not doing well, then the kids are going to be having a little harder time adjusting themselves. And so what we see in our caregiver program is that we see significant decreases in depression and clinical depression scores. We see clinical decreases in complicated grief symptoms. And that's in this 10-session program. So we have caregivers coming, they're in the program for an hour and 20 minutes every night. So, in about 10 to 13 hours of service, we're seeing people go from clinically significant levels of depression and grief to below clinical levels, which for us is really important. And the findings don't stop there. When we look at the children who enter the program, we're seeing similar levels of decrease in terms of their negative grief reactions. And so we're seeing them be able to say, hey, I'm still incredibly sad that this person is not a part of my life. I'm still worried that something's going to happen to somebody else who's close to me. But I have some skills and I have some coping mechanisms to help me manage this in a way that I feel somewhat empowered, that grief is not happening to me, that I'm kind of able to work with grief and say, hey, here's how we're going to go through this together. And my whole family's on board with me because we're all going through this program together and we're talking about, hey, that worked for you, but this didn't work for me. And so how do I know when you, like, I think Jessica's example of picking up her son that day, how do I know that what's going on for you is really just really tough right now and we need to bow out or we need to go do something that is out of our norm in order to meet you where you are right now. So we also have similar outcomes in our community-based programs where we go in and work with kids in our schools. And so we feel very fortunate that as a nonprofit organization, there are equal value on evaluation and research, direct service, and training and education. And so we're able to really learn every day how to do what we do better and how to improve the quality of care we provide to our community.
That's amazing. And okay, and the training and education piece, is that to train like future clinicians who are going to be involved in children's grief work as a profession?
That's part of it. So we have an intensive training program that we provide here at Judi's house. We have about 15 individuals who come through that program annually, and then they become part of a wider network of service providers who we know that we can tell people about, like, here's this great resource. We have one of our former trainees who has moved to the western slope of Colorado, and so there's very little grief-informed services there. And so we're able to say, hey, this person's in your community. She knows what she's doing. She'll get you on the right track. So that is one piece of it. The other piece is really going out into the community and providing education to those who are supporting grieving families. So today's November 1st. It's the first day of Children's Grief Awareness Month.
It is, yes.
And I know there's a great campaign that the National Alliance for Grieving Children are doing about being an everyday hero to children and families who are grieving. And so these educational programs that we provide, we're going out and we're teaching teachers how to be an everyday hero. We're teaching community members, anyone really who will listen. We are willing to go out and talk about, here's some things that you may not have considered. And here's some ways that you can be a support to somebody. And you never know when somebody is grieving, right? And so just holding this in mind and knowing this can be helpful in your interactions with anyone. But definitely when this pops up in your life and you think, I don't know what to do here, I don't know how to support this person, here's some strategies that you can have in your back pocket to be able to be present.
Yeah, I love that because as there are so many people in the world who are interacting with our children, like you mentioned, teachers, it could be coaches, it could be scout leaders, it could be church leaders, it could be neighbors and friends and extended family. In addition to that specific grief support program like you guys have, that piece I think is so important. All those other interactions on a daily basis that everybody, that the world is having with our kids.
Right. I think that's such a good point, Jenny. I think when we think about partially why we created JAG Institute, it's honestly to help make the world around us more informed around grief and grief awareness and being grief informed, so that as folks are having those experiences, if we can shift sort of the community around them to understand that it is in its own way a prevalent and critical public health issue, If folks have tools or understanding, we can make a shift. So it's not just having to come to a safe place like Judi's house to have that experience, but how do those ripple effects go farther into the community so that we can create the world around so many of us who are going through those experiences? Because the reality is it affects a huge amount of our community.
Yeah, yeah. And just to clarify, you mentioned JAG Institute. Can you tell us what that is?
JAG Institute is the research arm of our organization. So all the work Micki was talking about, that work is disseminated and created and pushed out from the Institute. So we formed originally as Judi's house and then decided that this research arm makes sense for us. And Micki, I don't know if you want to jump in and clarify a little bit better there, since that is so in your world.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that brilliant idea that Brooke and Brian had when they founded the organization to value research and education at the same level that they value direct service. And so many nonprofits, the evaluation arm, while it's important to bring the dollars in the door, there's often not the resources to do that kind of work, to show your impact, to show your kind of investment, that what the cost of inaction is and what your return on investment is there. And so JAG Institute, when we formally created that aspect of our community, of our organization in 2014, was really us saying, no, this is as important. Evaluation and research and training and education are as important as the direct service that we do every day, because there are kids on the Western Slope, there are kids in Alaska, there's kids in West Virginia who need this kind of support, and we have to find a way to come together as a field to be able to get those resources to children regardless of where they are.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Thank you. So that makes sense. So you've got this two-pronged approach. The Judi's house side is the direct services side, and the JAG Institute side is the research, the training, all those pieces. Okay, cool. Thank you. Speaking of then your research, you guys have done something that I see quoted all over the place, and it's called the CBIM, which is an acronym. Can you tell us what does CBIM stand for?
I'm happy to, because that has been something we've worked hard on for many, many years. The CBIM is the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model.
Okay.
And it is a statistical tool that approximates the rates of U.S. children and youth who will experience the death of a parent or a sibling by a given age.
Okay. And so can you tell us what's the big number, the U.S. wide? So, and just to, it's parent or sibling, I think it's by the age of 18.
Yes, right? So that's the number that we share most frequently. When we, all of this work has been something we've been dedicated to really since our beginning, but in the last couple of years, we've partnered with the New York Life Foundation to improve the model and to enhance the quality of what we're putting out. And so when we first met with them, they were like, there is so much information here. Let's break it down. Let's get one number that we share. And so it's astounding that 1 in 14 children in the U.S. will experience the death of a parent or a sibling by age 18.
Wow. Okay, wait. Let's just break that down. Mm-hmm. By the age of 18, and we're talking about the death of a parent or a sibling, so a very close family member, not all other types of losses. 1 in 14 kids nationwide?
Yes.
Wow. That seems like a lot.
Well, I think also, Jenny, it underscores when we think about the work that needs to be done is to elevate the understanding that this really is, in its own way, a critical public health issue that needs to be awareness raised and resources provided. And I think because it's around death and loss, sometimes our communities can feel like, well, that just happens. So that's part of our world. But if we can help people understand how incredibly prevalent this is, and that's why awareness needs to be there and resources need to be there.
Yeah. Okay. So let me dig into that a little further. So you say it's a public health issue. So what does that mean? Why is it a public health issue? Why isn't this just a problem that, okay, my family had a loss, it's my problem?
I think that it's prevalent throughout our entire, I mean, you can see the effects if we have unaddressed grief, complications, things that are not dealt with in so many different places of our society. And if our public as a whole is working through these issues and we're not providing resources, the potential negative outcomes, they can be significant.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think it was in the 90s that we really kind of stood up and said, wow, there's this thing called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. There's a study that came out. It was the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. And what they found is if you experience 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences as a child, you had all of these negative health outcomes. So you were more likely to be obese. You're more likely to abuse substances. You're more likely to have heart disease. Like all of these negative things were correlated with having adverse childhood experiences. Well, guess what? Losing a parent or sibling in childhood is an adverse childhood experience. And what the research is showing us is there's a similar pattern here, that if your grief goes unaddressed, you end up, it starts out with being absent from school more often. And then we start to see decreased performance. And then we see that maybe you're having difficulties in your relationships, or you're having a hard time managing your emotions. And over time, if that continues to go unaddressed, it becomes depression, it becomes anxiety, it becomes substance misuse, it becomes suicidal ideation. And so if we don't address childhood bereavement, if we don't create preventative programs like we have at Judi's house and so many other programs across the country, then this is a public health issue that we're paying for and we're addressing in other ways. It's showing up in emergency rooms. It's showing up when we go to our care providers and we're struggling with regular health diagnoses and disorders that could have possibly been prevented if you were provided the services that you needed when you lost your dad or when you lost your sister. And so that's really, I think, where we have been coming upon this. This is a critical public health issue. There were 2 studies released in the last probably 5 or 6 years that showed that experiencing the death of a parent or a sibling in childhood leads to earlier mortality. So
really,
yes. So if you don't get the support you need now, and there's not enough research to say, well, what exactly leads to it? It's just a correlation, looking at people who had this experience and at what age do they die, and looking at people who didn't and what age do they die. And adults who experience this as a child are more likely to die younger. And I don't want to paint too grim of a picture here. I mean, I know that many of your listeners, Jenny, are people who are like, well, wait a minute, that's my kid you're talking about. And what we also know from the research is that by accessing services, by accessing prevention, by accessing your community, your church, your school, and getting people to wrap around your children like Jessica did, that it doesn't have to be the outcome in your family. And we need that article that you mentioned. We need for legislators, we need for communities, we need for funders to recognize this and provide us with the resources we need to continue improving our programs so that we can see these children get back on a normal, healthy trajectory and thrive and survive the way that we all know they can.
Yeah. Okay, so much good stuff you just gave us. I'm trying to think about how to unpack that. First of all, I'm going to put a link to the article in the show notes. And I hope that people will take, well, I was going to say a minute. I think it's more than a minute to read it. I sat down, with a highlighter and a pen, and it took a while, but that's because it was so information dense and interesting. So I'm going to link that there. But I think some of what you're saying reminds me of the discussion I had with Vicki J in last week's episode from the National Alliance for Grieving Children. And she said, it's my belief that the earlier we can provide support for anybody who's had a loss, then the healthier adult that person is. And she went on to say, it's much easier to support a grieving child than it is to heal a broken adult. And I thought that was such a good point and kind of a summary of why this is such a critical issue.
Well, thank you for highlighting that quote. I have such respect for Vicki J, and to hear that put in such clear language, it is definitely what we see in the research. And so, yes, you're right. That article might take some time to muddle through, but Vicki just summed it up with that quote. We know that prevention has a smaller price tag than intervention.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of resource for prevention services nationwide.
Okay, so yes, right. I was just having this discussion with somebody last night, because it seems like on the physical health side of the healthcare world, the global we, I guess, have finally come around to putting more emphasis on prevention, right? Insurance companies will pay for mammograms. Insurance companies will pay for flu shots. They'll pay for annual checkups, right? We, I guess, as a society have come to realize that there are lots of good reasons why preventative medicine is beneficial from a human point of view and from a dollar's point of view and from every other point of view. I guess I'm wondering on the mental health side of that, it seems like we're not seeing that yet. I don't know. What are your thoughts or observations on that piece of it?
I agree. I think that in physical health, it is so much easier to show outcomes. It's easy to show we did this number of mammograms and we caught breast cancer early in this number of cases, and therefore we were able to prevent an early death due to cancer this number of times. It's not that easy when we're talking about emotional health and social health and well-being. It's so much harder to create those clear links between this is what led to this positive outcome. There's no mammogram for us, right? It's the service that we provide, but then there's the yes butters, but maybe that was because that child X, Y, or Z, or yes, but maybe it's because that family had all these other elements that made them different. And so research in social science is so much more difficult and oftentimes seen as soft. People often can disregard what we're finding and say, yeah, but there's lots of other reasons that could have happened. And so it's not an impossible row to hoe, but it's definitely an uphill battle that we are all having to come together and figure out how to ask the questions, how to create the programs, and how to design the research studies that are going to show the individuals who are writing the checks that, yes, this is as important. And so I totally agree with you. I just feel like in all aspects, our behavioral health or mental health systems are behind what we see in those physical healthcare systems.
And there's a cost behind that research, and many of these organizations are nonprofits that are also trying to provide direct services. If you look at our organization, the amount of money that we put towards direct services versus research and how we fund all of these things becomes difficult, and then making the case for funding for other folks as well, because these have to be long-term studies and a big investment in research. And there's always limited resources within our community for all of us to tap into. So I think that's an issue as well.
Yeah. One of the things that really surprised me, I guess being a layperson outside this field, I feel like there's studies for everything, right? Everybody's studied all these things. And I was so surprised when I interviewed Justin Yopp from the University of North Carolina. And of course, they have the book about the widowed dads program that they did. But they are also doing some academic research into the needs and challenges and struggles of widowed parents and widowed families. And I thought it was fascinating. I mean, the research itself was interesting. What really jumped out to me was the fact that very few people had already done that or were already looking at that space, and that they really are one of the few. And then you guys too are looking at, significant academic research here. I guess it just shocks me that somebody hasn't already researched all this and has answers for us.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's part of why we have to raise awareness that childhood bereavement is a critical public health issue, because I think there is a belief out there that kids are resilient and they'll bounce back from this, right? Like, we all had tough times as we were kids too. But we are really grateful for a number of researchers in the field. Dr. Erwin Sandler at Arizona State University was one of the first who really said, we need to apply academic standards to the research happening in this field in order for it to be taken seriously. Dr. Julie Kaplow at Baylor and Dr. Chris Lane are all individuals who are saying there's some great work happening in this field and there's definite needs. Let's do the type of research that will get us into the journal publications that probably most of your readers or listeners would never really want to listen to or read. Like there are these heavy academic journal articles that are sometimes necessary to bring some legitimacy to the field, so that we can get the funding, so that we can get the NIMH to say, okay, we want to fund programs for this, as opposed to just continuing to think that communities will rise up and donate money so that programs like Judy's House can exist.
And the NIMH being the National Institute for Mental Health.
Yes.
Right. Okay. You mentioned is it Julie Kaplow? I think that when I was talking with Lane Pease at Kate's Club, she told me, is she the one doing the research on traumatic grief and some of those, that topic?
Yes, she has the TAG Center, the Trauma and Grief Center, and a lot of her work, along with Chris Lane, is on developing instruments or measures that can help us to be able to understand what does a child need. So when children walk in our doors at Judy's House, they get an extensive interview. Every member of the family gets an assessment that helps us to understand what's going on for this 7-year-old versus this 11-year-old versus this 35-year-old mother. And how can we support them here at Judy's House with what we have to offer, but also connect them with other resources in the community that can maybe meet some of the needs of what we don't do. And so Julie and Chris are working on developing some instruments that can help us to get to that a little quicker, to understand when a child's level of disruption from the grief that they're experiencing is so significant that they might need more intensive support than a peer support program or a group program. And so I think what's really incredible, and I, can't say enough positive stuff about what New York Life has done in terms of bringing researchers like Chris and Julie and Erwin and all of us here at JAG together so that we're not working in silos, and so that we are kind of communally tackling these issues and that it benefits the entire field. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any idea when they're going to have this instrument available? I'm sure there's not a date, but are we talking like next month or next year or next decade?
I'm not. And I know Julie gets that question often, and she would be a great person, I think, to have on the Widowed Parent podcast as well. But I know that they are working very hard, and they've already put some tools and instruments out there that are helpful. So
yeah, because I think as a widowed parent, that's one of the hardest things. I mean, most of us who find ourselves widowed parents are not experts in mental health, are not experts in grief, are not even experts in, like child development and psychology and, those kind of things. And that question of like, my kid needs help. Well, first of all, getting to that point of recognizing does my kid need help, or is this something they'll outgrow, or is this a normal kid thing or whatever? But then when you get to that point of my kid needs help, well, what help do they need? Or do they need the help that can be provided by attending a peer grief group monthly or every other week or whatever? Or do they need something that's a higher, more intensive or more in depth or more targeted to a certain struggle or a certain mental health challenge or, that kind of thing? So that sounds fantastic, having some kind of way to try to assess that and figure out what the right next steps are for that kid or that family.
Yes, a lot of what we talk about in the early parts of our program at Judy's House is assess and address. So at first we have to assess to understand how we are now going to move forward and address what this family is presenting with, what this child is presenting with, and what they need within their community to get on a path towards adjustment and healing.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about, we've thrown out some terms here, peer grief groups and the mental health system. I guess, can you kind of just talk a little bit about, well, for example, I think we've talked a lot about the peer grief groups and the kind of support, but what are the challenges of accessing the mental health system for counseling or for help in a time of loss? Is that just something you can just, go find somebody and knock on their door and insurance is going to say, fantastic, yeah, we'll pay for that? I mean, what do you see, or what do you think, what's happening there?
It really depends on whose door you're going to walk through. A lot of centers across the country who are more mental health geared rely on reimbursement from insurance in order to bring in their revenue. And the way it stands right now, there is not a diagnostic code in the manual that we all use, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in order to get paid, essentially. There is a diagnostic code called Persistent Complex Bereavement Disorder that is in the appendix of that manual, which means that it's being studied for consideration for including. But then there's lots of criteria that go with that diagnosis. You have to have a pretty significant level of disruption for a clinician to be able to ethically say, you meet criteria for this disorder. And then you're calling it a disorder. So that's that piece of grief is a normal, natural reaction to the loss of anything. In this case, we're talking about a death loss. But then to say that because your reactions are so severe, you have a disease or a disorder, that can be really off-putting and really disturbing. And so there's a lot of controversy and a lot of dialogue in the field about whether or not there should be a diagnosis. There was a change in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The DSM is what it's often called for short. Several years ago, it used to have a notation within major depressive disorder that you couldn't be diagnosed with major depressive disorder if you were grieving.
Huh. Really? That seems a little strange.
Because I think the argument, and I should probably do a little more research on this, was that experiencing symptoms of major depression after you've lost an important person is normal. But that doesn't help if you're the person experiencing that. And you're like, this might be normal, but it doesn't feel good. And I want to feel better. And I want to go talk to somebody who can help me feel better. But I can't, because they can't give me this diagnosis to get paid. And so there's a lot of confusion in the field. I think some clinicians will often give what's called an adjustment disorder diagnosis, because that is a diagnosis that you can get paid for. And but sometimes if you're someone who adheres strictly to the guidelines within that manual, you would say, but technically this isn't an adjustment disorder. So going through the healthcare system and going through insurance to get reimbursement for bereavement and grief care can be a really disruptive process in and of itself. And when you're already grieving and you're already struggling, to add to that this confusion about who can I submit this to and what am I going to get reimbursed for and what do I need to pay out of pocket, it's just another detail that you often don't have space to attend to.
Yeah, I can really chime in, speaking from the client side, that it makes such a huge difference to have a place like Judi's House in your community, because you are exactly in that place where you're probably dealing with your own family's finances, levels of stress that kind of make figuring things out really hard. And, for our organization, we talk about it as being an easy door to walk through. We welcome the whole family in. We are so fortunate. We are funded 100% by philanthropy, by funders, by donors, by grants, by people who see the value in the work that we do. So we don't charge for our services whatsoever. And the reimbursement piece is just not on the table. So for us, it's this amazing experience for the family that's coming through. But that's not always possible everywhere throughout the United States. So how do we make it more accessible? I think we've solved our problem here because we have such great support from the community and funders. But how do we mimic an experience where when folks are going through the hardest time, they can access the support that's critically needed and not have it be so complex?
Yeah, such an important point. I guess it shocks me to learn that, you could have somebody who has had a death loss and is struggling significantly on a human level. I'm not talking about a diagnostic level or a psychiatric level or, checking boxes or whatever. But as a human being, they're struggling significantly. And if they don't meet these criteria in the DSM for one of these things, depression, anxiety, PTSD, et cetera, that the way the system is set up, the way the game is played, that the insurance companies will say, good luck, we're not paying for you to get that help that you as a human being need. It just seems, well, first of all, surprising. And secondly, like, I don't know what needs to be done, but something needs to be done about that.
It seems wrong, right? Like,
yeah.
And that's why I think, to get back to, I think, your question a little while ago, why is this a critical public health issue? This is why. It's all of it. It's the lack of research, although it's increasing over the years. It's the inability to get the funding that we need to do the quality of work that we know families need and want. All of that is why it feels like it's just wrong, and why it feels like the field has really come together to say, we all bring unique skills and we all bring unique resources, and how can we put that all on the table to tackle this problem, because it needs to be corrected.
Yes, very, very, very well said. I think we could keep talking about this forever, because I could go through and I could read every single one of my highlighted comments to you, and I could ask you to speak to it, and we could have a fascinating discussion for the next 6 hours, but we probably shouldn't do that. So let me just ask you a few more questions here. You guys have this really fantastic support offering program in the Denver area. So I'm going to ask you in a minute more about where people can find you. But for people that are not local to you, who are not going to be able to access your services, I guess, do you have any tips on finding support, a grief center in their own communities, or what kinds of questions they should ask, or what they should look for when considering if a program might be, something that would meet their family's needs?
There's two resources that we typically refer folks to. The National Alliance for Grieving Children has a resource guide online for programs across the country. And the Aluna Network also has a very thorough guide. And at the Aluna Network, you can actually call them regardless of where you are in the country, and they will do a phone consult with you to help you find what you need in your community and what's most accessible to you, which is a incredibly generous resource that they offer.
That's good to know. And they're located here in Seattle.
Okay, see, and their programming is so nationwide that I forgot that they were in Seattle.
Yes, well, it was
like they're everywhere.
Yeah, founded by the Moyers, and Jamie Moyer, of course, was Mariners star pitcher for years and years. It was a while ago. I can't remember when it was exactly. But then they went on to found this and Camp Aaron and all these things. So yeah, the Seattle connection is there with the Mariners.
Yeah, and so that's a wonderful resource. And regarding questions, I think just giving yourself permission to ask any question that you have. I know from working with bereavement centers across the country that the primary priority of everyone is to provide whatever support we can. And so I don't think those questions ever feel unhelpful. And so asking for what you need, asking what you don't know, just don't hesitate. Ask the questions. When we talk with folks about seeking out a mental health provider in the community, we say, call them up, ask for a consultation. You should get to know them and you should feel comfortable with them before you're sitting down and starting your first session. And so just don't be afraid to ask for what you need, and there's no stupid questions, to ask whatever it is that's on your mind and on your heart.
Right. Okay. All right. Fantastic. Thank you. I'll put the links for the NAGC's list of resources by state, and they have a resources by state. They also have a list of nationwide resources, things that are not location specific. And then they also have a list of resources in Canada. And I have a lot of listeners actually in Canada and the UK and Australia. I'll have to find something for UK and Australia, because I haven't seen a list of resources there yet.
I will say the UK and Australia are way ahead of us
really?
in terms of recognizing childhood bereavement as a critical public health issue. And so I'm not sure how extensive their networks are, but in the UK, there's a program called Winston's Wish. And the programs in Australia, I'm not as familiar with, but I know that our first article that we published at Judi's house was actually in an Australian journal. Because I think they're a little ahead of us in recognizing this and putting it forward as a priority.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good to know. That's great. I'll look up Winston's Wish and put a link to them as well. And maybe there's somebody, maybe them or somebody else that I can talk to for an episode in the future about resources in the UK and then again in Australia. Yeah. Okay. So let's wind up here. I want to ask each of you the same question. So Jessica, we'll start with you. If you could say one thing to widowed parents, what would it be?
To remember that you are not alone, that there are other people around you in your community you might not even know, but you're not alone. And also to not be afraid to tap into your own emotions and feelings on what's the right way for you and your family to proceed through your journey. Don't try and imprint onto some idea of how it's supposed to be done, because that just doesn't exist. And it's okay to feel and react and be adjustable.
Okay, thank you. And Micki?
I 100% agree with what Jessica said. And I think, I really appreciate the work of Brene Brown also. I think in those moments where you're starting to feel like you're doubting yourself and your ability to get yourself and your family through this, remembering that you are enough.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Is there a particular Brene Brown book that if people haven't checked out her work, you think that they should start with?
I feel like starting with the Gifts of Imperfection is always a great place to start. That kind of sets the foundation. And then if you get hooked from there, just continuing on. She has so many wonderful things that talk about how embracing the aspects of ourselves that we sometimes wish didn't exist can actually help us to improve who we are every day and how we show up in the world.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. And then Jessica, let me ask you, so where can listeners find Judi's house if they'd like to, if they're in Denver and would like to connect with your services, or if they are anywhere and are interested in learning more about you guys and your research?
Sure. The best place to find more information is to go to our website, which is judishouse.org. And we spell it JUDIS, judishouse.org. And we've got all sorts of resources on that website as well. And can start the process of accessing our services if that's needed, or just learning more through that process.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I'll link that in the show notes as well. So my guests today are Jessica Maitland Mayo and Micki Burns from Judi's house in Denver, Colorado. So Micki and Jessica, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Jessica Maitland Mayo and Micki Burns of Judi's house as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 43. And hey, a few more notes here for Children's Grief Awareness Month. We're just getting started. It's just the first full week now. I hope you saw the Washington Post article that went out on November 1st. The Widowed Parent podcast was mentioned there. So big thanks to the author for including me, along with Justin Yopp of the Widowed Dads program at the University of North Carolina, and also Vicky J of the National Alliance for Grieving Children, and also a couple other experts were quoted as well. Terrific article. Marjorie did a great job with that. So if you haven't seen it, I'm going to put a link in the show notes, and I'd encourage you to take a look and also to share it, both with any widowed parents that you may know, as well as other people close to you that may be interested in a closer look at childhood grief. Terrific article. Lots and lots of activity going on social media this month. So if we're not connected on social, you can connect with me at Lisk Jenny, LISKJENNY, all one word, and that's on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. it would be a huge help, actually, if you'd consider sharing the posts, retweeting them, commenting on them, liking them, so forth and so on. The way social media works, the more activity these posts get, the more people see them. And since the goal is to raise awareness of childhood grief and childhood bereavement, it would be terrifically helpful if you would share and like and so forth. What else? Let's see. Oh, in the next few days, I've got some content coming for allies of widowed families. So that would be the friends, the family, the colleagues, the neighbors, the people that we know that want to help. I don't know about you, but I get questions all the time. People know, based on my experience with my husband being terminally ill and then eventually dying, people know that I've been through that, and so they ask me when they, somebody else, their colleague or their neighbor, is in a similar situation. They ask for some tips and how they can support their friends. So I decided to go ahead and put together a document that people can download and share with that information. So please be on the lookout for that. And it would be awesome if you would help share that with anybody and everybody who would be interested in knowing about that. There'll be tips on how to bring food, besides just, setting up a meal train and bringing a casserole. What else can you do? What kind of texts can you send that are actually helpful? Tips for writing condolence cards, inside information on what to say and what not to say, what's actually helpful in that regard. So please do take a look, keep an eye out for that and share it if you don't mind. I think that's all for now. I'm looking forward to, actually later in the month I'll be bringing you 2 special episodes. I had a lot of fun recording these with my friend Karen Millsap. We're approaching the 1-year anniversary, believe it or not, of the Widowed Parent podcast. So it started last year during Children's Grief Awareness Month. And so at the end of November will be that 1-year milestone. And so Karen and I recorded 2 conversations, actually. I asked her to interview me, so I turned over the microphone on my own podcast to share a little bit more about my journey and about the podcast and what I've learned and all that stuff. So I had a lot of fun with that, and I really appreciate Karen helping me out. Anyway, have a look out for that. And thank you, as always, for listening. And until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.